So the number one thing that stood out to me, and I can't speak for my colleagues, but they probably would agree with this, is that the murderer of Karina did not want her found. And the murderer of Elizabeth Short absolutely wanted her found. There was no doubt about that. So, I mean, right off the bat, they're different. These are different crimes. The relationship between the offender and the victim is likely different, and the motives are likely different, or I should say, possibly different. But that was the number one thing that stood out to me. These are not at all alike, people, and I understand why, if somebody is looking at the Black Dahlia case, why they would go look at Karina Holmer's case. Two very high profile cases of young women who were cut in half. And you don't see that very often. So obviously you're going to compare them. But the comparisons really stop there.
That's Julia Cowley, a retired FBI profiler and the host of the Unsolved podcast. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Julia Cowley is a retired FBI agent and criminal profiler. I went back recently and looked at the number of times she's appeared on the podcast, and we're on the 15th episode. We've talked about a range of topics, from her career at the FBI and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigations, and true crime ethics with our friend Brett from the prosecutors, to cases like the University of Idaho murders, the Lewis Clark Valley serial killer case, and the United Healthcare CEO shooter. We've discussed cases she's worked on, like the Waletka murders and the serial killers, Joe D'Angelo and Israel Keys. For me, one of our most memorable and personally meaningful episodes was our coverage of the unsolved murder of Philip DiMartino, a beloved marketing manager at a real estate firm in San Francisco, who was found dead, stabbed 48 times in his apartment after a night out in San Francisco's Castro district. Phil's case was Julia's first as a lead profiler at the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit. For investigators, I think just like reporters are, when it comes to certain stories, some cases just catch you. And that was one for Julia. And today we're going to talk about one of those cases, I think for both of us, one that we were both on the periphery of. It started on Sunday, June 23rd, 1996, when a homeless man discovered a trash bag in a dumpster behind an apartment building on Boston's Back Bay, or in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood, containing the dismembered upper body of 20-year-old Karina Holmer. Julia's podcast, The Consult, recently did a 3-part series on Karina's case. Karina Erika Holmer was born in 1975 in Sweden. In early 1996, she won 10,000 Swedish crowns in the lottery, which she used to fund her travel to the United States. She joined an au pair agency and was placed with a family in Dover, Massachusetts, an outer suburb of Boston. That started March 1996. Described as joyful, adventurous, and eager to explore Boston, she often went out with friends and was known to go to local bars and clubs. Her final weekend began on June 21st, when she and friends went to Zanzibar, a nightclub on Boylston Place in Boston. Her friends left one by one. Karina stayed behind and was last seen around 3 a.m. on Saturday, reportedly intoxicated and alone. Witnesses saw her walking up Tremont Street and possibly getting into a car. Her whereabouts remained unknown until her upper body was found in the dumpster. It took time for the police to link the torso, which had been cleaned, to the missing woman. More than 300 witnesses were interviewed, including her employer and a Boston police officer she had briefly dated. The crime scene was never found. The police reportedly attempt to lift a fingerprint off her body. The case remains unsolved. I was a reporter at the Boston Globe at the time of Karina's death, and the case always stuck with me. Julia became an agent later in the FBI's Boston division, and it stuck with her too. I was on assignment covering a murder in the Shenandoah Mountains of Virginia when Karina disappeared and was, following the case. And as I got back to, Washington, I remember reading a column from one of my colleagues from the Globe who wrote, quote, "Somehow it was easier when Karina Holmer had no name." Today, we're going to discuss Karina's life, her death, and the case. Julia, thank you for joining me for the 15th time. Congratulations.
Has it been a total of 15 times, or did you break up the recordings?
So I broke them up by how they appeared on the podcast.
Okay,
so we've actually
I'm going to say 15 times.
Right. It's really more like 8. It's more like, I think it's 8. So it's still
a lot. We've had a lot of discussions.
Yeah. And congratulations, by the way, to you and your colleagues on your 100th episode, which you passed a couple months ago.
Yeah.
I know that was a goal. That is awesome.
It was a goal. We're going to get to, I told myself, I want to just try to get to 100 episodes and then, see where we're at, see if we want to keep going. I thought 100 seemed like a good number, but I feel now we haven't even scratched the surface. We have to keep going. So right. now it's maybe 150 episodes.
150.
We'll see.
I'll see you at 600.
Yeah. I can't imagine that. I saw True Crime Garage. They've been doing this for 10 years and I don't see us going for 10 years.
10 years.
But we're all a lot older than those guys, so.
But I the one thing that's very obvious, I think, to me about your podcast is that you guys are in your element when you're doing it. You're doing something you love to do. And it's just nice to think about the idea of when you guys were at the FBI, you were bringing that same passion and love and just whip smart intelligence. I'm not sure if you saw it, but I tweeted about your last episode and I said something along the lines of, clearly these people did not get their certificates off a Cracker Jack box. Like
we bobbed it. We love the work, but we love each other. Like we really do. We're good friends. We were good friends when we worked together. And I mean, I knew Susan before joining the behavioral analysis unit, but I didn't know her very well. I really knew her by reputation, which was outstanding. And when I looked at her and I looked at her career, because she's a senior agent to me, I was so impressed by her, and she was the kind of agent I wanted to be. So I felt very fortunate to have the opportunity to work with her at BAU. And then, of course, I met Bob and Angela, and there are other colleagues, too, that I worked with that I learned a lot from. But these are my closest colleagues, and we just really value each other. I appreciate their perspectives, their knowledge, and I love doing the show with them.
Yeah, it definitely comes off that way. I was mentioning in the introduction that I had been in Virginia at the time, Karina Holmer disappeared and then was discovered. And I had been covering another case that really stuck with me, which is the disappearances of 2 New England women, Loli Winans and Julie Williams, who were murdered in Shenandoah National Park. And, before I came back to Boston, I went to the Washington Bureau, and I think that's where I first heard, although I'm not 100% sure, colleagues talking about the case. And, even though I never reported on the case, it really stuck with me. And I'm just curious for you, I know you came to Boston a few years after. Do you have any ideas on why the case stuck with you?
I think There are a couple of reasons. First of all, it was a very different type of crime in Boston. It is not the type of crime that, well, really many cities see generally, but I'd gotten to Boston. I was learning about it. I was studying it. I was studying the history of the Boston FBI, which had a lot of problems and a history of some corruption. There was a lot of reporting on the Irish mob and the Italian mob and the crimes associated with them. And Karina's case just stuck out as being just very different than the other high profile cases. There was nothing else like it. And I sort of felt, I guess, an understanding of Karina because I was new to Boston. I knew what that felt like. And obviously she'd come from another country, but when you come from the West Coast and you move to Boston, it's like
you might as well have come from another country.
it's a tough assimilation. It's different. And so I think those were just some of the reasons. Obviously, what happened to her just struck me as so horrific that I think that aspect of the case just piqued my interest, and I never forgot about it. And always, when I see things written about her case, I read it, hoping for some, advancement in technology to solve the case. So it just stuck with me for so many years, and I can't really explain why, other than I think any case I could become very interested in. It just happens to be the time and place where I am, and it just something about it may strike my interest. And there are just a lot of cases out there that I just can't forget about, and I try to read about whenever I get a chance. And I don't really know specifically why a specific case will stick with me. But I did know when I started the podcast, well, even before I started the podcast, but was thinking about starting the podcast, that I wanted to do Karina's case on our show. It was the only case that I can think of that I had not worked that I knew I wanted to do. And in large part because I just wanted to understand what happened. And I wanted to see what my colleagues thought and if we could put something together that just gave me a better understanding of what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Shopify's point of sale system helps you sell at every stage of your business. Need a fast and secure way to take payments in person? We've got you covered. How about card readers you can rely on anywhere you sell?
Thanks. Have a good one.
Yep, that too. Want one place to manage all your online and in-person sales? That's kind of our thing. Wherever you sell, businesses that grow with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 a month trial at shopify.com/listen. Shopify.com/listen.
So your own, to some extent, curiosity about it. Was it a case that I don't recall this at the time. I don't recall them being involved, but was it a case the FBI was involved in? I don't remember that.
I think they were. Maybe at least cursory involvement, but I think there was some communication with the FBI's, back then I think it would have been behavioral science unit. I'm not sure exactly the extent of that assistance that was provided. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's interesting just because we don't see it in the news. The FBI is often helping law enforcement agencies in the background, whether it's evidence response or analysis or other things along those lines. For me, I was sort of thinking about what really caused me to gravitate toward the case, and I'm not exactly sure if I have an answer about this one or other ones, but one of the things that stuck out to me in thinking about it was why I think it resonated with the public. Maybe this is part of why it resonated with me, was that, there was, and I had that same feeling you had when I moved to New York, bright-eyed and, and and everything is sort of like an exploration and learning, and it can be hard to adjust to it. But it was that combination of sort of Karina's joy and her innocence with the sort of brutality and the mystery of the crime. Like this really adventurous young woman who had come, to Boston from a foreign place. The crime had no clear motive. It just sort of struck you as heinous. And we couldn't find a crime scene. We couldn't find many clues, I guess, as a community. And that contrast between this joyous girl who was fun and innocent and exploring, and that just brutality of her death was so haunting. And I remember early in the coverage of the investigation, um, you know, investigators were looking everywhere. And I remember in the first few days, it was all about the people who were at the club that night at Zanzibar, and then the family she was staying with. And there were a ton of stories on, on them, and could they be connected? Because it's sort of like the cliche story of the au pair and the affair. And then, there was this local musician, and then a homeless guy, this eccentric homeless guy that apparently everybody in the neighborhood knew about, who was there. But people just kept rolling through almost desperately through suspects. But I do remember, for me, in listening to it and listening to those things, and I knew nothing that I know now, but none of it just rang true for me as I was hearing all the potential suspects. And I was just curious what a profiler looks for in cases like that. Like, I know there's always going to be the media speculation. There's always going to be people chasing potential suspects. But what do you guys look for in those kinds of situations?
Well, starting off for me, I like to look at what actually happened to her, because you hear just the basic gruesome details, and you hear she was bisected, and her body, at least only the top half of her body, was ever found, and she was discarded in a dumpster. And so many people have drawn comparisons between her murder and the murder of Elizabeth Short, who was known as the Black Dahlia. And because Elizabeth Short was also found bisected, but she was murdered out in Los Angeles in 1947. So likely, very unlikely to be any connection between the two of them, but they were forever connected because they were both cut in half. But when you look at each of the cases separately and what actually happened to them, they are so different. They're likely very different motives, even though you have this big headline making action that the offender took. But when you look at the details, and so we're looking at what actually happened to her. We're looking at where she was found. We're at the neighborhood. We're looking at her victimology. And so all of those things you're putting together, looking for potential motives, what her risk levels were, and who posed those risks to her. So those are the types of things we're trying to assess as best we can. So that's the type of information we're hoping to gather. You can't always get every detail, but that's where we start. And that's why after I did Karina's case, I wanted to do Elizabeth Short's case to demonstrate how very different they were.
The contrast between
the
two. What stands out about the two when you're thinking? Because I think this is like a tendency that we have. And I know this, just from a lot of cases I've been involved. We see sort of like someone killed in a similar fashion or disposed of in a similar fashion. And we tend to think, well, those things must be linked.
Or you have a similar type of offender.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
So the number one thing that stood out to me, and I can't speak for my colleagues, but they probably would agree with this, is that the murderer of Karina did not want her found. And the murderer of Elizabeth Short absolutely wanted her found. There was no doubt about that. So right off the bat, they're different.
Mm-hmm.
These are different crimes. The relationship between the offender and the victim is likely different, and the motives are likely different, or I should say, possibly different. But that was the number one thing that stood out to me. These are not at all alike, people, and I understand why, if somebody is looking at the Black Dahlia case, why they would go look at Karina Holmer's case. Two very high profile cases of young women who were cut in half.
Right.
And you don't see that very often. So obviously you're going to compare them. But the comparisons really stop there.
Yeah, it really doesn't. Yeah. And that's a really great point, that you can learn something about the offender relationship based on the way those two different people were disposed of. And I think, we've talked about this before, that it's one of the things that I'm really impressed about listening to the podcast is the ability for you, Bob, Susan, Angela, to sort of step back away from the noise and kind of clear your heads and look at the facts that are there and see the facts for what they are. And, I had mentioned this to you recently, that I think in investigations, using sort of like your cognitive biases and your heuristics in those first few hours or days of an investigation can lead you to a lot of like shortcuts or ways to sort of like put yourself near the offender. But the longer a case goes cold, it sort of feels like those heuristics and cognitive biases become the things that get in the way sometimes of solving them, because we make certain assumptions. And, I always wondered in this case, did we spend too much time focusing, for example, on the father of the child that she was taking care of, because that fit this narrative for us? And, I was bringing that back. I think what I like about the podcast is you guys often step away from a lot of those sort of, what I would say, cliches and cognitive biases that we fall into that sometimes can lead us really astray.
And that's why it's so important to start with, well, what happened here? Let's look at the crime itself, what the injuries are to her, where she was found, where she was, disposed of. Just look at that. Look at her victimology, and just cut out everything else. And what does that tell us? What can we glean? And then start trying to prioritize suspects. And we don't really talk a lot about suspects on our show, but doing Karina's case, I think I worded it. I'm always pretty cautious with my wording. I said that her employer had to be deprioritized as a suspect. Now, I understand, and he had to be fully investigated.
Right.
But what had happened to him afterwards with the media and people blaming him that really don't know the investigation is so unfair. And what the family was probably put through, what I believe being falsely accused, and to people to this day who maybe talk about it online, some people still think he did it. And there's really, I don't think that he did.
Yeah, there's no real sort of strong connection other than the fact that he was the employer at the time. There was, I remember there was this article in the Globe, and I don't want to get it wrong, but I think the gist of it was that the father had like a dump permit, a permit to utilize a dump. His wife was a painter, he was a photographer, but he had this new permit at a dump. And I remember seeing the headline and thinking to myself, well, if he had a dump permit, I think he probably had a better place to put her than, here. But it made like, it was on the cover of all the different papers. And I get it. They were looking for the second part of her body. But sometimes I think they're like very obvious things like that stick out to me, where I sort of say, well, like it was probably somebody, somebody different, but you can make anything into
suspicious. You
yes.
can make it all suspicious. And when you get tunnel vision like that, and I'm not saying the police had tunnel vision because he was, I think, appropriately vetted by police, but the media and people who just thought, well, he's being suspicious. I mean, anything that we do, if we become a suspect in a murder, may be viewed as suspicious. And my understanding is that he had this permit already. He was disposing of items that they needed to dispose of. But then you have to look at it kind of logically, like you were saying. Uh, this offender went to such great lengths to dispose of Karina. Why would he go dispose of her in a dump where near his home where he has a permit to go? That makes absolutely no sense when we see
Right.
that this offender clearly thought about what he was going to do. That just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. But of course, that became suspicious. And there were some other things that were suspicious. But I think if you took any potential suspect and put
Mm-hmm.
them under a microscope, people could view normal behavior or normal everyday things they were doing anyway as suspicious.
You mentioned that the offender clearly didn't want her to be found. What were the signs that you saw? Obviously, dumping her in a dumpster, but also, I think, probably cutting her half. The fact that the other part of her wasn't found. Was the
Mhm.
location a part of that too?
But she was put in a garbage sack. So, again, another attempt to try to hide her. So, yeah, I think, and the location was interesting, but it was, it was in a dumpster. I mean, people throw things away. They don't think they're going to be found again. And clearly, he was somewhat successful since her bottom half wasn't found. So it's just basically the condition and the circumstances of which he was found led us to believe he was wanting to make sure she wasn't found, which led us to believe he believed that there might be a known connection to her.
Right. I remember. I think this is a reporter who had told me this, who had said this is somebody who had covered the old, New York mob wars. He said that one of the tip-offs for the cops in New York toward the height of like the early 90s, late 80s of, a mob hit was that if the weapon was still there at the scene and it looked like a mob crime, you might as well like kick the weapon in the river because chances are you're not going to be able to trace it back. And, and, you know, what you were saying just reminded me of the idea that the way we get, or the way that people get rid of their weapons or get rid of bodies says a lot about you know, whether they think they can, what they think is going to get them caught, right? If I leave the gun at the crime scene, I'm clearly not worried about the gun if I just drop it there and if I leave the body out. But if I make the effort to kind of carry the body with me and take that risk, I'm taking that risk for a reason.
Yeah,
And yeah,
it's a huge risk to continue to spend time with somebody you've just killed, that extra time. And that means it's important to you. It's prioritized behavior. So why is it so important? It's because if you leave it as it is, or if she's found where she's murdered, or she's found or identified quickly, you believe you might be a suspect. And that relationship could be because he knows he was seen with her that night, whether he was talking to her, whether he knows his car was seen picking her up. It could be because they had a past relationship. So, which kind of goes back to, obviously her employers needed to be vetted. They needed an alibi. They needed to prove they weren't in Boston at the time. All those things have to do that. You start close to her, work your way out and rule out these suspects. But, there's just a tremendous amount of effort to hide her. And it's so risky because not only is he spending time to bisect her, but he's, washing her off, which, could be for practical reasons just to, because if she's all bloody, it's messy and it's just slippery. Put her in the bag, carry her likely to a vehicle, and drive around with two halves of her body and get out of your car, risk being seen in a city environment.
Mm-hmm.
Very high risk, but worth it. Why is it worth it to do that rather than just throwing her out on the road?
Right. Or leaving her body wherever it is, right?
Wherever it is, right.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things, and you can't always take things that seem obvious for granted, but one of the things I did look up is when a body is dismembered, it's usually dismembered at the scene where they're killed. And so,
interesting.
Yeah, so I know that seems maybe obvious to people, but it's something, those are the little things we want to verify. Are we, if we say that, do we have evidence to back that up? Are there statistics? Is there research to back that up? So wherever she was dismembered is likely where she was murdered.
Yeah, and I don't know that it's entirely obvious because I think people have a hard time understanding why, right, naturally, why someone would dismember someone. And, I'm sure it could be a part of some kind of fantasy, but, if you look at dismemberment as a practical tool, it does some things. It makes it easier to carry the body. It makes it harder for people to identify the body. But, and it makes sense, to me. But I think for a lot of people, it's just so hard to understand how someone could do it or deal with the gore of it or things like that they have a hard time getting their head around why anyone would do it.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly an offender who can deal with gore, and this was extremely important for them to do.
Right.
That they're willing to risk the mess. And there was nothing that indicated to us, unlike Elizabeth Short's murder, that there was gratuitous violence, that this was somehow part of a fantasy. There was nothing else done to her that made us think that. We thought that the severing of her body was for practical purposes, to transport, for easier transport and easier discarding.
Right. Which kind of makes you think, okay, just in thinking about something like that, it makes you, if I were to think about something, I'm just starting this out here off the top of my head, like if you have a house and a garage and you can throw a body in a car, right? The part where you're going to need the body separated is just between your car and the dumpster. So you can start to think about, okay, who would really, really need a dismemberment? Well, somebody who has to, bring the body out of a place where they could end up really close to people. So,
Or
family or in
being
an apartment building or behind. Yeah. So,
and that's where you consider the environment she's found in. Now, she wasn't found that far from where she was last seen. She was last seen about a mile away at Zanzibar, in that area, and ends up in a dumpster about a mile away. So it's very likely. And I talked to the geographic profiler, Doug McGregor, who's really helpful in clarifying some things. We talked about that crime scene corridor, and it really indicated it's very contained, and therefore this offender likely lived close to other people, just as you said. So he cannot just carry a body out or even try to wrap it in a blanket without maybe a concern that he would be seen by others. So therefore, he's got to sever the body in half and take two separate bags out that don't look as suspicious. So, and I'm basing that in large part based on the environment where she was found, where she was last seen, and then where she was found. This is likely something that occurred not too far away from where her top half was found.
right. And just knowing the area, it's not a place, if you were coming from some other far place in the Boston area, it's not where you would travel to put a body. it's not like it's busy. The Massachusetts Turnpike is behind there. Fenway is not too far away. You've got Boylston and the parks, but it is on this little corner there, that
Mm-hmm.
little corner, which is a little bit more private than everything else around it, which makes me kind of think like the person didn't trip across this. Like they
No,
knew this area. They knew, yeah.
it was I went back over there before when we were researching the show. I happened to be in Boston, and my husband and I went for a walk down there. We were down near the Boston Common. I went by where Zanzibar used to be, and we took that walk all the way down. And I just thought I would be comfortable in the middle of the night, which is probably at the time where she was dumped. Because it's it's on a main road there. The apartment building faces Boylston Street, which is a main thoroughfare through Boston. And there's a lot of shops and restaurants, and it's a busy area, a lot of students. And then you have this side street, Ipswich, that goes right by the side of the building, but then it bends around and then it's parallel to the Mass Pike as well. And it's kind of a service area road. And it goes behind apartment buildings and their parking lots and their other dumpsters
and
along
there. And there are more
there.
dumpsters. Yep.
Yes. Not only dumpsters that way, but dumpsters in the other direction as well. There's alleys. And so it really seemed like a really convenient way to just, and I picture him coming from for whatever reason, I pictured him coming from the west, but that could be wrong. But just pulling up on the side of the building, getting out of his car, walking the short distance to the parking lot behind the building where the dumpsters were, and just throwing her in there and getting back in his car, and just off you go back. That's how I pictured it. And
it's funny, I have that same image in my head, which is sort of like from the south and the west and behind Fenway. But I think it's in part because that's the spot where you could just slide right in there and just
yes, it really just made a lot of sense to me that this is a convenient place if you're not going to go outside the city, because you could drive not too far and go find a wooded area somewhere, but that's not what they chose to do. They chose to stay within the city, which tells me they're very comfortable there. It tells me that this crime probably happened within the city. I don't think it happened too far away from where she was found. And this was just a very convenient location for him to pull a car over with, at the time of day or early morning hours, very little foot traffic, or, it would just be very easy.
Yeah. I even wondered, and, not to malign anybody there, whether it was somebody in that building. Because that's another reason that you can't, carry a body down the stairs or something.
Well, that's interesting you bring that up, because that was something I didn't think. But in talking with Doug McGregor about just, the mindset of people, like it really is more about how many people or places are you actually passing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's more about that.
Take a tall building, like Empire State Building or whatever tall building or apartment complex, lay it on its side and imagine that length of a walk, and then the stairwells. That's what the fear.
Yeah, it's
a
really
vertical liver.
Yeah. And I hadn't really considered it in that way. So I opened my mind a little bit to that it could be someone who was in that apartment. However, I do think they canvassed that apartment. The police did, for obvious reasons. But I just hadn't considered that, somebody who is moving a body and they're on the top floor of a building, that whole
quarter mile,
all those people and all those different doors they might be passing, or that's just something in somebody's mind that they have to overcome. So if you're out in the suburbs and you're passing a number of houses, you might need to go a mile away.
You think of it like this, right? You think about it.
Yeah. That's not a way I thought of things before. So,
and I think Oh, Doug was making that
I was
because
going to say Doug just felt like it could be even closer than I think I thought.
because I think one way to look at it too would be, not just the building that was right there, because there are a lot of other apartment buildings in the area. But when you think about how far the offender has to go, you have to take it and almost like topple the building over and add that length to whatever it is. But I, the one thing I'll say though about this one, I mean, it could be somebody in the building, but something about that back road, like you were saying, Ipswich, and coming to that spot, if it was somebody in the building, they just lucked out by living in the perfect building to hide a body. And it begs the question, what happened to the other
other
half of her? Yeah.
Yeah. And it could be that he lived in a different building and this was a little further away from where her bottom half was found. Now, I know the police took different dumpsters and looked in different dumpsters or in the area, but it's always possible some of those had already been emptied or maybe their canvas didn't go out far enough. But I just wouldn't be surprised if she was in another dumpster not too far away.
Yeah. And what about, I'm thinking about something like a dismemberment happening in a place like an apartment building. I imagine, and this may be like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and having watched that too many times, it just being so noisy that if you're in an apartment building, someone would hear something.
Yeah.
But then I think, I don't know.
Yeah.
I have yet to dismember a human.
Yeah.
A turkey.
Well, another thing Doug had pointed out is that, which is something we need to consider, is that most dismemberments do happen in apartment buildings because it is tougher to get a body out of an apartment building because you have to pass so many people. So a lot of dismemberments do happen. In this case, however, a power saw was believed to have been used. The police did release that information. So you're right, that would be loud. So, that adds a little bit of
complication.
It does. It changes it a little bit. Like perhaps he was in, not a congested building, but rather a duplex somewhere,
or a corner on a building, or
and he had her for a while. I mean, she disappeared that night. She was not found. So he had all that next Saturday, and she wasn't found till the afternoon of Sunday. So he had a long period of time. He had a whole day with her. So if he knew the comings and goings of his neighbors, maybe it wouldn't be something they'd necessarily have heard. There might be a work area or a basement somewhere he had access to. But like, Doug was saying, as the police, you'd go around to within 200 yards of that, did you hear a power saw? To every,
anybody hear a power saw?
Anybody hear a power saw during, odd hours or something like that? Or, not just did you hear it? Do you know anyone who has one?
Yeah.
And it just, because that would be something that would be unexpected for apartment dwellers necessarily to have power saws.
Right. Unless you're the building superintendent or you're a tradesperson, right?
Right. Like who has one? Not necessarily anything you found suspicious, but do you know anyone who might have one? Things like that, which, we didn't have access to every interview that was done, but I'm sure those questions were asked when they did their neighborhood canvas. But just as us looking at it from the outside, those are some questions we would be asking.
And another weird thing about the time was the big dig in Boston, where they were ripping up the highways and rerouting everything. You had a lot of workers from other places, but also the normal paths. Like, I don't even know how somebody would go back to see what streets were closed when, or what was around the turnpike, but there were more transient people coming in and out to work during that time too.
Mm-hmm. And the big dig, so I remember it well. And the area where she was found, like the area from like Zanzibar, where she was last seen, to the area where she was found, was largely unchanged by the big dig. The big dig wasn't going...
further down.
it was in different areas of Boston. So that also made me think is probably more contained because it's a mental barrier to pass, like to go over the interstate and come from the other side. It's just more of a, and therefore it would be more of a mental barrier to pass through all that construction.
Construction work
So,
and slowdowns and
yes.
unexpected stops.
So
And
somebody who did this likely didn't live in areas where he had to pass through the construction zones or cross an interstate somewhere. That just would be more of a mental barrier. And now this again is this is all based on probabilities.
right,
But
right.
but it's interesting to think what would be a mental barrier. And I'm telling you, the Big Dig was a mental
A
barrier.
barrier for everyone.
It was terrible.
Right.
It was a mess,
Even for people who
and
didn't have bodies in their cars.
it was a mess every day. And I find this very significant to this case because every day there was a there was a detour, a different
Mhm.
one. And so I was trying at this time in my life, trying to learn my way around Boston. And this made it so difficult
Oh.
because nothing ever looked the same either. They put up, railings and scaffoldings. I'm like, where am I now? And Boston's confusing anyway because it's not on a grid,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
it's a tough city to get used to, and
I
so
remember when I was living in Brooklyn, right on the edge, and in the middle of the Big Dig, I would pop into a new neighborhood and be like, "Oh, this is this neighborhood," and then be like, "Wait a minute, it's this neighborhood," and not have, I would have walked in it for a while, not realizing, "Oh, I've been here," because you couldn't tell how things connected close downtown.
oh, yeah, it was quite challenging. So I can definitely see that that would be a mental barrier. So I did not feel like the offender came from an area that would have been on the other side of where the construction would have been. So again, that just puts it all kind of closer to where she was found. Um, yeah, and I I can remember too, I could find my way. I could weave my way in back to the office, or if I had to get somewhere, I could figure it out. But if I had to ask somebody to come to my office to meet me, I could not tell them how to
Forget
get.
it. I have no
I'm like,
idea.
good luck.
Yeah, and
Your own.
map books were useless.
But you
Um,
better be here because the FBI wants to talk to you. You better be here on time. I'm not going to tell you how to get here.
good luck.
Yeah,
Come early.
yeah, or else. But I couldn't explain how to get there because I'm like, I don't know if that detour is still there. But then you want to go down this little alley, and then you want to take this left right there, and it has to be immediate left, or you're gonna end up on your
Or
way to
it'll take 30 minutes
New
to get back.
Hampshire.
Right.
Yes, exactly. Or you're gonna you'd be stuck. It was so challenging. It made me the woman I am today, though. Made me tough. I'm
Right.
not afraid of any traffic
Any
now.
traffic now, right? Yes, I know. People in DC and LA will talk about how traffic's bad, and I'm like, yeah, you have no idea.
Yeah.
You have no
Gosh.
idea. What happens when
Yeah.
but that makes a lot of sense that itself would be a big barrier. I'm curious, like if you guys, with obviously more than the police knew on the first day, as profilers, or investigators looking at a case like that, what would you want to do first? The visit the scene, learn more about the victim. How do you kind of, what's your process for, I guess it might be
Well,
different.
my process would be different than in the detectives because that would just be different. If I was the detective, I'd do what they did. You
Canvas.
obviously canvass the area, talk to the people who last saw her, obviously interview her employers and people that know her employers. They had to be ruled out, and talk to her family, all of those logical leads. And usually by the time a profiler gets involved, those things have been done. So that's not where I would necessarily, I mean, I obviously would want to know the results of all of that, but without being influenced, I would want to see the scene.
Mm.
The scene and the autopsy, those were that would be where I would start. And then of course, that's also where detectives start. what actually happened to this victim. And then the first major hurdle they had is they had to identify her.
Right.
That was another issue, and that obviously as a profiler we don't have to worry about, because usually the victims have been identified by the time we're looking at a case. But and because they didn't know who she was, that makes it very difficult to start the investigation right away, like who to talk to, and you're behind.
Right. Instantly behind, because you
Yeah.
don't have your actual crime scene. You have a dump site. You don't know who it is. And as I recall, I think I have this right. She wasn't working the next day, so she didn't necessarily get quickly reported missing either.
Right.
So you have
Yeah,
all these things.
she was off for the weekend, and typically she worked for the family during the week, and her employer had a studio in South Boston,
Mm.
which was a couple miles from where she was last seen. But he would allow her to stay there on the weekends, and she could go out in Boston with her friends when she was off during her free time and explore Boston. So that was the circumstance. She was in Boston.
Thanks for joining Julie and I for part 1. We'll be back next week for part 2. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again soon.